Hello, this is the Bureau of Lost Culture. In the 1960s, we know that there was a revolution in the head, with all those wild new ideas that were emerging, and a revolution in the heart with all that love that was floating around, and a revolution in the soul, with those strange, exotic, mystical beliefs that were coming into consciousness. But there was also a more quiet revolution going on too. A revolution in the gut, in the belly. New ideas about how food could raise consciousness and change the world. A countercultural cuisine, you might say. And that is what is on the menu in this episode of the Bureau of Lost Culture. I'm Stephen Coates. But before we tuck in, I want to say thanks so much to Nick Edwards, to Prue, to Mick and to Den, who've given us their support this week in building this little countercultural community. Thank you. We really appreciate it. Join them, join us at bureauoflostculture.com. You can get our newsletter, suggest guests for future shows, support our wild endeavours. Okay, well, that was the starter. Now on to the main course. His story starts with a watermelon, and food is inextricably connected with all the ingredients of his long countercultural life. He cured himself of dysentery and hepatitis in Central Asia on the hippie trail by diet. With his brother Gregory, he opened a restaurant that became the go-to place to eat for the great and good and the glitterati of swinging London. He's a countercultural entrepreneur, an author, a food and an environmental activist. He changed what our supermarkets stock on the shelves. You've probably eaten some of the products he developed. He's pushing 80, but he looks 20 years younger. Testament, no doubt, to the diet he's followed. He's led a very successful life in the counterculture and beyond, and he's still at it, writing, speaking, growing his organic vegetables on his small holding near Hastings. We're going to talk about all that and other stuff on the menu. The effects of diet on an LSD trip, the invention of the veggie burger, green and black chocolate, and looking at the future through the wrong end of a telescope. He is Craig Sams. Hello, Craig.
Hi.
Welcome to the Bureau of Lost Culture. Now, before we dig in, I thought I would read something that you said or wrote. In 1965, I travelled the hippie trail just a few years before it acquired that name, hitchhiking, walking, and taking trains and buses from London to India, via Syria, Iraq, Kuwait, Iran, and Pakistan. Eventually, I was in New Delhi, where I spent a night in the general hospital with advanced amoebic dysentery and infectious hepatitis. Realising I might die if I stayed in the hospital, I struggled on to Kabul, where I resorted to the simple folk remedy of unleavened wholemeal flatbread and unsweetened strong tea to treat the dysentery. The liver pain subsided, and I was fit enough to travel back to London. I'd learned that diet and health were inextricably interlinked, and back at university in Philadelphia later in 1965, I adopted the macrobiotic diet. On graduation in 1966, I decided to open a macrobiotic restaurant in London. Do you remember that?
It's all clear as a bell, yeah.
Well, listen, before we get, we could just cycle back even further. Who is Craig Sams?
I was born in Nebraska during the war. My dad was fighting in the Pacific. I was conceived in LA, and my mom went home to Nebraska and had me in July of 44. My grandfather farmed hemp because it was part of the Navy's need for rope. Nobody had invented polypropylene rope. And watermelons, which were taken to supermarkets in nearby Sioux City. My mother was checking the watermelons to see if they were ripe when she got her labor pains. And I guess the last thing I tasted in the womb was watermelon. And
do you still like drinking watermelon juice?
I am totally addicted to watermelon. It does something to me that nothing else does. And, we get about a small watermelon a week, and it's gone by the end of the week, or by the time the next one arrives. Watermelon.
It's quite significant that your life started off then with a piece of fruit.
Yeah, and my life in paradise ended with a piece of fruit, and I was ejected into the world. But that's, anyway, that's by the by. Then my mother went back to L.A., My dad was so screwed up from the war that she divorced him and went back to the farm. But they got together, remarried. He was very ill, post-traumatic stress disorder, call it what you like, but he was really ill. My mum took him to a doctor in Hollywood, a Dr. Nakadari, a Japanese doctor, who put him on a strict sugar-free, dairy-free, whole grain diet that you could almost call macrobiotics, although the word hadn't entered the language at that time. My dad got better, and they went on to have my brother. So we ate a fairly healthy diet as kids. We only ate whole wheat bread. We only ate brown rice when we did have rice. We weren't strictly vegetarian, but we moved to England. My dad's work took him to London, and he was friendly with a Sikh family who were vegetarians. So we kind of didn't eat a lot of meat, and we understood about diet and health. Well, my parents understood about it. Really, our mother understood about it, and the rest of us ate what we were given.
So what year was this that you came to London then?
We came to London in 1951. Okay. So we actually had a ration book.
Right.
We were here for the big pea super fogs, particularly 53.
That must have been quite exciting for you, for a kid from Nebraska then, to come to...
Yeah, from Nebraska, and then growing up
in LA.
To the age of 7 in California, in LA, Santa Monica and Venice. And then wham, bam, we were in London. We then lived in Germany for a year, and then my dad's work took him to Omaha, Nebraska, which was great because we were near my mother's family. I wouldn't recommend Omaha in the 1950s. Its biggest source of pride was that year they had slaughtered more hogs than Chicago. And we were within smelling distance of the stockyards where all that...
I love the way that food goes through all of your stories. It's great.
And then we lived in France for a year and then moved back to London. I went to university in Philadelphia, and my mum and my brother were in London the early 60s. And I would come home every summer. Fell into the London scene, which was... in the early days, places, sort of trad jazz scene. And then, of course, that morphed into a more rhythm and blues scene. So I was going to the Flamingo and the Marquee and the 100 Club, but mostly the Flamingo. And then I'd go back to university. I remember I took a Beatles record back with me, and the kind of knowledgeable guy in our fraternity house said, well, it's very derivative. It sounds a bit like the Beach Boys and a bit like this and that. And then we were going to a fraternity conference in Chicago. I was in charge of the food. That's where I learned how to run a restaurant. And passing Cleveland, a radio DJ played this song. He said, this is from a group in England called the Beatles. That's Beatles. And he played, I can't remember what it was, Love Me Do. He said, well, it's, accounting for taste. That's what they like over in England. And, of course, the Beatles were huge.
Called the invasion, wasn't it?
Yeah.
The British invasion. Quite early on, your story's entwined with this island and London as well. And where I started off, which was you setting off on this hippie trail, but it wasn't actually called at that time. You must have been one of the first people to do that. 65 was quite early.
I took a year off. I spent the early part of it in Formentera. I was there probably until October, November, came back to London, and then in February hit the road to the east. Traveled by train, by bus, by hitchhiking, across the desert between Damascus and Baghdad. There were trucks that knew their way. There wasn't actually a road, a proper road for a lot of that distance. And then the hippie trail was kind of a northern route. I did the southern route, so Bushehr, Shiraz, Zahedan, Kerman. It's a southern way into Pakistan and Quetta, and then to Karachi, and then across to India. And I just had a bag with my possessions in it, but I had a little portable record player.
Wow,
just come out with that. Amazing. And I had 4 LPs. So I would play music, and that would engage with people wherever I was.
So you'd plug in? It was an electric player, or was it wind up?
Batteries.
Batteries, okay. That now really is completely inconceivable, I think. Somebody would take that route in that way now because of all the conflicts that have been since. I mean, Iraq and Kuwait, for instance, Iran, and even in Pakistan, the world has changed so much, hasn't it? And for a young person then, to take off in that way, obviously pre-mobile phone, pre-internet, so what you were relying on was other people's stories and recommendations and tips, right? And then you just set off with a record player, a few clothes and bits and pieces and some cash, and that was it.
But people hadn't seen Europeans traveling in that way. So, there were times when, a village outside of a town in called Abargu in Iran, a sort of mud-walled village, and people came running out and sort of dragged me in to stay the night because, I relieved the usual pattern of life in a village. Well, also, you
must have seemed like an exotic creature.
Yeah.
Who'd sort of come over the horizon with your bag. So, I imagine tremendously exciting until you got ill. Must have been a very colourful sensory experience, right, to go through all that. And that getting ill, of course, is quite significant in your story as well, isn't it? Because curing yourself effectively by making some dietary choices, I'm assuming...
It was in Iran when the dysentery first hit that people said, you eat this flat wholemeal bread and unsweetened tea, and it worked. Then I got to Pakistan where they didn't have that kind of bread. And the amoebic dysentery leads to hepatitis. I didn't really cure it until I got to Kabul, where they had the same kind of food as they had in Iran. Right. And then suddenly my eyeballs, which the white was not even yellow, it was green from the amount of bile that was floating around, they just cleared up and I was fit to travel again.
Looking back, do you think that was a very significant moment for you? You already had an upbringing where food and diet and were already important, but was this a kind of signal moment where you connected fundamental health issues with what you put in your body?
It was more about I just cured the dysentery, which was really inconvenient when you were traveling. And then I went back in London. I stayed in Britain, and I was well enough. That summer I promoted on Shanklin Pier on the Isle of Wight, brought bands down from London, which nobody had ever done before because they hadn't tackled the logistics of getting the bands back. So we had Jimmy James and the Vagabonds, the Action, the Clique. And then I went back to university and some friends were into the macrobiotic diet. It was just kicking off. We would take turns going to a supplier called Infinity Foods in New York who had brown rice and miso and tamari and kombu seaweed and those kind of macrobiotic staples. On my trip, I also went to a restaurant that had just opened called The Paradox. And it was America's first macrobiotic restaurant.
This is a sidebar about the macrobiotic way of eating. It was developed and popularized by the Japanese, particularly by George Oshawa in the 1930s, and subsequently by his disciple Michio Kushi. Whole grains and a variety of cooked and raw vegetables, beans, mild seasonings, edible seaweed, fermented soy products, fruit, fish, nut and seeds are recommended, combined into meals according to the ancient Chinese principle of balance known as yin and yang. Yin and yang is a Chinese philosophical concept that describes interconnected opposite forces. Yin is the receptive, yang the active, seen in all forms of change, such as the annual cycle of the seasons, winter and summer. Sexual coupling, female and male. That's what it says here. I think I'll probably expand that these days. And the socio-political history of disorder and order. All food is considered to have both properties, with one dominating. Foods with yang qualities are considered compact, dense, heavy and hot. Those with yin qualities, expansive, light, cold and diffuse. Brown rice and other whole grains such as barley, millet and oats are considered by macrobiotics to be the foods in which yin and yang are closest to being in balance. Other principles of the diet are to reduce animal products, eat locally grown foods that are in season, and consume meals in moderation. The Macrobiotic Bookshop in New York's East Village, close to the Paradox restaurant that Craig mentioned, was raided by the FBI and told not to sell any books until their content had been reviewed. Eventually, the books were taken away and burned. Professor Frederick Stair of Harvard University wrote an article in the Reader's Digest calling macrobiotics the hippie diet that's killing our kids.
The word macro means big and bio means life. So it kind of has a dual meaning in that it makes your life richer, more fulfilling, but also longer. So it's kind of the art of longevity as well as being healthy and happy in the here and now. So it hadn't taken off it was a kind of a specialist thing. There were a couple of macrobiotic restaurants in Paris. I started supplying macrobiotic food to the UFO Club, which had just opened.
Right. So that's an important part of this story too, isn't it? Because the UFO has come up a lot in this programme. Just round the corner from here in the Blarney Club up in Tottenham Court Road. And this tiny little club, which didn't even last very long, but it seems to have been this kind of symbolic and psychic centre for a lot of countercultural stuff. So before we dig into that and what happened next with you, you were part of this rather small London underground scene, right?
I had met a couple of guys in Delhi when we were all staying in a Sikh Gurdwara, because the Sikhs have a tradition of hospitality to travellers. I had some opium I'd bought in Quetta, and the street dentist in Karachi had cocaine because that was what dentists used as a painkiller. But I wasn't taking any of that stuff because it wasn't well enough to do it. So I gave it to them, and in exchange they gave me 1,000 microgram Sandoz capsule of LSD from the people who had invented it. Well, they said it's 1,000 micrograms, so you don't take the fifth of it at a time maximum.
What was the first experience of acid like for you?
I was in Mildenhall in Suffolk, waiting for a flight back to the U.S. My dad worked for the American Air Force, so I could fly free back to university, but it was on a space available basis. And so I took it in the morning and went for a walk in this beautiful Suffolk countryside. It was a perfect way to experience acid for the first time. I remember standing in front of somebody's garden of flowers and exclaiming to her what incredibly beautiful flowers she had, and she was incredibly flattered. But, it was as gardeners are when everybody compliments their work. But, and then it turned out there was a space on the flight, and so I concluded the trip in an airplane where they had human remains on the plane because somebody had died and they were flying them back to the U.S. to be buried. It was, everybody's first trip is like amazing in some way, and that was amazing. And when I got back to Philadelphia, I still had 4/5 of that capsule viable, and I hooked up with other people who were just beginning to get into the same thing. And I do some people in New York from the Juilliard School of Music who were into DMT, and so that also became part of the picture.
So do you think that was like consciousness raising for you then, opening you up to that whole thing that was starting to happen in America and the UK? Countercultural movement, I suppose, but I mean, it's been called lots of things, hasn't it? The Age of Aquarius, the sense of transformation and the potential in the world to change things and stuff.
Yeah, it was people we just knew something was happening, but it hadn't really coalesced into any kind of political or a movement quite yet at that stage. And then I came back to England. I hooked up with Michael English. He was a friend who became Hapshash in the Coloured Coat.
Artist.
And he did all the posters for the UFO Club. Pete Townsend's girlfriend and Michael English's girlfriend made clothes in a basement on Eccleston Square. I was working with an artist who dyed blobby silk designs, so I would take them silk, which they would make up into dresses and shirts and sell through boutiques. We would have parties there where we'd all take acid on a Friday or Saturday night and listen to Billy Preston, because that was about as psychedelic as music was in '66. And then the UFO Club opened.
And you provided food to the UFO, right?
Well, I'd take food down there every night before they opened, and that was available on sale. And then I had a couple of macrobiotic colleagues by then. A friend of mine from Formentera was really dedicated to it, and people would buy the food between a Pink Floyd set or a Soft Machine set, and she or another friend, Angie, who was immortalized in Davy Graham's song of that name, would sidle up to them and say, "Do you know what you're eating?" and explain to them how sugar was bad for you and whole grains were good for you, and explain to people what this funny food was that they were eating. And a lot of them were tripping anyway, so they were very open to that kind of conversation.
It's quite interesting on the tripping thing, isn't it? Because there's definitely a time, just from my personal experience, there's definitely a time when you want to eat, and there's definitely a time when you don't want to eat.
Yeah.
You know, maybe a bit later on you want to eat something. And I suppose you're basically providing people with subconsciousness raising food, right? I mean, and it's quite interesting. So it wasn't just a case of, okay, here's some, home prepared or prepared by love food. There was a sort of agenda that we need to get this out. We need to kind of like tell people about this way of eating. Part of that kind of countercultural activity in a way, right? The countercultural cuisine.
Well, acid was on sugar cubes.
Mm-hmm.
There was a kind of philosophy, an idea around that, if your trip is going bad, take some sugar and that will perk you up again. And what we were saying is no, eat whole food and you won't have that the opposite of a sugar rush, sugar slump.
Dive.
Yeah, and
because Joey Mellon told me that that sugar was absolutely essential. That they used to have bowls of Smarties and stuff lying around, so that or have a Mars bar when you dropped.
So I knew Joey when he was working at Hung on You, and we were saying, no, eat a whole food diet and you'll be able to take acid and be high without any negative
I'm loving this
effects. Yeah, so that was our message, if you like, to people who were taking acid, is if you want to enjoy acid, get your diet sorted out as well.
And get your diet sorted out in advance, right? So get away from the fish and chips, the sort of British cuisine, whatever it was at the time. Start eating healthy, and then when you do actually take a tab, you're much more likely to actually have a positive experience, right?
And people were, they'd order a burger or whatever it was that they would normally eat. If they were sensitive to it, suddenly they would realize, God, this is like a dead animal. It's been ground up, and it's it's kind of
pumped full of weird stuff.
Yeah, I mean, they just, it was an intuitive reaction to the kind of food that was around. A lot of people would go from the UFO Club to a place called the Golden Egg on Oxford Street, which was, that kind of food, and it was one of the few all-night restaurants in London at that time. And they'd order food and then they couldn't eat it because it just didn't seem right somehow.
Yeah, it's tough.
So it's hard to pin down exactly what it was. It was just a gut reaction, really.
So let's move on to the opening of Seed.
My first restaurant was in the Centre House in Camden Hill Road in Notting Hill. And that was opened in February of '67, but we had a little cohort of customers because they were people who were at the UFO Club. And one of those was Yoko Ono, who I hadn't realized it until a year or two ago. She worked at the Paradox when I had gone there and been inspired to open something like it in London. And people just wrote in a guest book. We had a guest book that said, I am not in possession of any illegal goods. And that covered me if somebody did get busted, if they came in the restaurant or whatever.
Yeah, because I heard that you were getting complaints about getting the smell of weed.
Property. It was called the Centre House. They had a yoga thing upstairs and various kind of alternative therapies. Christopher, the owner of it, just shouted down, can you please stop smoking dope down there because the smell is coming all the way up to the second. In the early days, people just felt like it was attractive that you could go somewhere where you could smoke a joint and eat food. You couldn't do it in any other cafe in London.
Right, so Yoko Ono and everybody else would sign in and also put a little disclaimer saying we're not carrying or holding any stuff. Yeah. Have you still got the guest book?
Yeah, I have. I've got Yoko's signature and various other people, the people who came there.
Right, very good. So that was the first one. And then Seed came a little bit later, right?
A guy called Graham Bond, he brought his portable Hammond organ down one night to play. And the idea was that he was going to come at 9 o'clock and play until we closed at 10:30 or 11. He didn't get there until after 11. Typical Graham Bond type incoherence. And he played, and the neighbors were outraged. It was a residential area, Camden Hill Road. And suddenly here was this sort of rhythm and blues organ banging away at, midnight. We agreed to leave. And I found premises, much nicer, bigger premises on Bishopsbridge Road, and set about getting that open. At that point, a few things happened in my life, and I ran into a problem with immigration. It wasn't possible for me to stay in the UK. I went to the US. My brother, who had come back from University of California at Berkeley, picked up where I'd left off and got the restaurant open. And it became an overnight success.
Here is another sidebar about the Seed restaurant in West London. Seed had 2 rooms in a big, rambling basement of a hotel. One had cushions on the floor, set around tables made out of the 4 to 5 foot diameter reels the electrical cable was wound around. So customers met one another as there were no reservations and no exclusivity of tables. In the other room, there was a tent style hanging from the ceiling and normal square wooden tables. The menu, called by Gregory Tomorrow's You, was rice and vegetables for 4 shillings, that's 20p. There were 2 specials, differentiated by the size of the earthenware bowl. The light special, 7 shillings and 6 pence, and a heavy special, around about 50p, which was browned rice, vegetables and nituki. And then 2 other portions, vegetable tempura or a bean dish, falafel, tabbouleh, hummus or whatever was special that day. Seed also supplied, as part of an outreach and education mission, a free meal which comprised the brown rice and vegetables, plus a cup of kuchika from the always-on Help Yourself tea boiler. A tape recorder belted out the latest sounds and grooves from a wide variety of rock genres, but mostly psychedelic and mellow blues. Mark Bolan of T-Rex walked to Seed to get the free meal one day, and it was there that he met Mickey Finn. An event that rock historians cited when calling for a blue plaque for historical buildings to be put up on the site many years later. Regular visitors, as we're going to hear, included John and Yoko, Terence Stamp, most of the Stones, as well as vegetarian macrobiotic activists and enthusiasts, and most of the denizens of the underground alternative culture that was springing up all over the country.
John Lennon and Yoko became regulars. John Peel was a big fan. Terence Stamp was a regular. I'm just dropping names, but it just gives you a sense of what the place was like. Yeah, Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones came there. A lot of people who came because it was cool. They weren't particularly concerned. They accepted the fact that they had to eat brown rice and vegetables, but it wasn't their primary motive for being there.
It was because it had become part of the scene in some way as well, right?
Well, it was the only restaurant, really, that was completely cool.
Just to go back to what we were talking about earlier, this thing that I keep coming back to, because I'm fascinated by, is this sense of you and your peers, this community of people, this fairly small community of countercultural people, having this sense that you were changing things, that there was something in the air, some potential transformation. Is that something that you felt?
Totally. We thought that everybody would be eating a macrobiotic diet by the early 70s. My brother put it quite neatly. We could see the future, but we were looking through the wrong end of the telescope, so it seemed a lot closer than it really was. And people who adopted the diet rarely fell by the wayside. Once you got into a healthy diet and appreciated its benefits, you were hooked for life. And people from the restaurant, they're still in touch. People remember it fondly. That was the impact that we had was on food. But yeah, the expression, when the mode of the music changes, the walls of the city shake. The International Times used it on their post. The music was changing, and we felt that was somehow revolutionary. And then there were all the women's liberation, gay liberation. It was all happening
the ecology
at the
movement.
same time. The ecology movement,
Right.
the green movement. We were getting organic food before organic certification even existed. The only validation was that the people who supplied it to the people who delivered it to our restaurant, they were members of the Soil Association, and that was authenticating the vegetables they produced that we then used in our restaurant. So we were as organic as we could get.
Organic meaning grown without the assistance of artificial fertilizers and chemicals. It's fascinating to look from 2022. You go into every single supermarket in this city, and certainly all around the country, and I imagine in most countries now, is that there's an organic section. It's got bigger and bigger and bigger, and there's organic this and organic that, and it's sort of taken for granted. It's become completely mainstream. But I mean, you were talking about it right at the beginning, really, when the one restaurant, maybe a shop or something in the city, people didn't really know the terminology even, right? What's quite interesting, I think, about this aspect of counterculture, the cuisine, if you like, or the cook, is that it really did follow through. It really did have that impact and has lasted through to these times. As, of course, as the gay movement, as is the women's liberation movement, as is the environmental movement as well. It's not the only thing. But a lot of that other idealism of the 60s in terms of societal changes and stuff, a lot of it didn't happen, did it? It foundered in the 70s. It wasn't able to become realised in some ways. But
probably the biggest setback was the fact that the drugs that encouraged that kind of high consciousness were banned. That's changing now. Psilocybin is being used very successfully in therapy in places like Oregon. Amanda Fielding's work with the Beckley Foundation is transforming and that was what was happening in the 60s. The psychiatric profession said mental illness is going to be a thing of the past because we have these drugs that will cure it. Timothy Leary ended up being criminalized. And he was a psychotherapist. He knew what these treatments could do for people. But it all got out of hand because it was self-medication. That barrier is probably disappearing now. So it's going to be quite interesting to see how things unfold in the next decade.
I hadn't thought of that before, but the banning of certain drugs, the attempt by the government to control people's consciousness, that did put a block on a lot of that kind of idealistic change that might have come about. There's another thing I wanted to talk to you about, Craig, which is right there at the beginning, or it seems like it was right there at the beginning, because you, maybe like also like Nicholas Olbury, maybe like Felix Dennis too, you were one of the people who were also entrepreneurial, right, in the counterculture as well, which has been borne out through the rest of your career. We're going to touch on that later. And you were one of the people who actually were able to take this stuff and turn it into a business as well, right? Yeah, right from the beginning. The restaurant was profitable. My brother opened a small shop on All Saints Road. It was called Sarah's Grain Shop, but it was basically a natural food store. And up till then, health food stores sold vitamins and supplements and this and that, but they didn't have a full range of cereals and grains and that kind of whole food stuff. And that then became
the prototype for hundreds of natural food stores. And we then started pre-packing natural foods. I would give talks to health food shop owners explaining why they should stock this stuff. Our sales guy at the time was someone called Jay Landesman, who would call up health food shops and say, are you getting customers with long hair and colorful clothes coming in asking for foods like brown rice and miso and tamari and kombu seaweed? And the retailers would say, well, yes, we are. We have for you the answer, the Harmony Foods range. We have a package. It was the Down to Earth package that gives you an introductory range of all the products. Put them on your shelves and you can satisfy those customers. And that was the beginning of the transformation of the health food trade into natural food stores. It was. We certainly commercialized it shamelessly. We had the shop moved to Portobello Road. It became a much bigger shop. It became a destination for people from all over the country. They would come down and buy rice, brown rice in 50-kilo bags, like sacks that they would load into the back of their car because you couldn't get it anywhere else. But eventually, through Harmony Foods, you could get it everywhere in the country, in your nearest health food shop or natural food store.
But it seems to me that there was a group of people who were entrepreneurial. Either they had the skills or maybe the motivation or the mindset or something to actually see things that way. Steve Jobs, made Apple, he put, was a kind of countercultural type himself. I mean, he puts down his, taking acid for him. I think for Bill Gates too, actually, was like a kind of signal moment in his kind of evolution. Was able then to actually make this into a business, which is going to affect things in a much bigger way than talking or dreaming about it, right? Now, what happened next with you is that, so Seed has become this destination venue, Ceres has become this destination venue. You're also spreading out into changing the way that health food shops make, and then Whole Earth happens. So tell us about that.
Well, Whole Earth was originally Harmony Foods. That was the name. And our symbol was a yin-yang sign, but instead of just the normal yin-yang, we had a leafy branch coming up and roots coming down. So kind of emphasizing it was yin-yang and food, because that was the driving philosophy of macrobiotics. The shop on Portobello Road, our next door neighbor, closed down, and we took that over and opened a bakery. In the bakery, we were manufacturing for the first time, and we made jams sweetened with fruit juice instead of sugar. We made peanut butter, which we then developed the peanut butter business. We then changed the brand name to Whole Earth. Whole Earth moved away ultimately from brown rice and beans because anybody could do that. We reached a point in 1982 where we were probably too big for our boots. My brother had just created the veggie burger. We'd registered the trademark and launched that.
That's an important thing to mention, and to underline actually, is that your brother, Gregory, invented the veggie burger, right?
Yep, and the name, which we registered as a trademark because the term, as well as the recipe, nobody said the words veggie and burger in the same word.
That's what Alice said earlier. It's like an oxymoron.
It's hard to believe because it's like part of the language. And, you'd never be able to register it now. Right. At that point, we divided the business. He took the veggie burger and flew solo with that and really made it happen. He built it up as it became huge. And I kept Whole Earth Foods, which was mainly peanut butter and jam. We figured out a way to stop oil separation without using hydrogenated fat, which nobody had ever done before. And the jams sold really well everywhere, France, Italy, the U.S. It was really kind of the backbone of the business through the 80s. I found some farmers in Africa who were the only people producing organic peanuts at that time. They failed an aflatoxin test, which you have to do on peanuts to make sure they're safe to eat. And the French agronomist who was working with them said, well, these farmers also grow cacao. but I visited a cocoa plantation and fell in love. I got a sample of chocolate made, 70% solids, and we launched Green and Black's, the first organic.
I'm sure a lot of people listening have had the pleasure of eating Green and Black's chocolate at some point, or I was eating a bar myself only last week. I mean, that's quite a big thing as well, Craig. I mean, you've gone Whole Earth, very successful brand. And Green and Black's another very successful brand. You've also, I'll just drop in as well, you've written several books about food, right? You're also heavily involved with the Soil Association, which, as you mentioned earlier, has been promoting the sort of organic revolution in vegetable growing and stuff. Your whole life really has been rotated around positive effects, both in terms of personal diet and in terms of the ethics of production of things that we eat, right?
True. And it always amazed me that we weren't more successful, because it still amazes me how many people eat junk food grown in horrendous conditions that are destroying the soil that is the foundation of our lives, that are exploiting animals in a horrendous way, so that we can have more money to spend on other stuff by saving money on food. So a lot of it was about getting products that were right all the way through, from the way they were grown to the way they were produced. My wife, my girlfriend at the time, came up with the name Green and Black's because green implied organic and black because it was the darkest chocolate. When we showed it to supermarkets, one of them, I won't name them, sent it back with a bar of their cooking chocolate. And the simple message was, people don't eat this stuff. This is what you use for cooking, but nobody's going to eat 70% chocolate. Well, people are eating 85% chocolate now.
Sure, not even more so, yeah. You have changed things, haven't you? You're surprised that you haven't changed it more, but then you said earlier on that you and Gregory thought that everybody would be eating macrobiotically by the early 70s, and I suppose there's a lot of reasons for that. What about taste? I mean, you can eat healthy macrobiotically, and for you, is that the most delicious way to eat as well?
Food in our restaurant, people may not have come for the food. The thing you got tasted good. It was very easy on the palate, and yet it was really healthy. You're eating brown rice with a sauce made with tahini and tamari. We did vegetable beignets, tempura vegetables, and of course that always goes down well. Foods like that, they do taste good, and you just need to get that right. There's this idea that somehow vegetarian food is bland and boring, but it's not true at all.
Also, it might not have that immediate hit, the salt, the sugar thing, right? But I mean, the big thing, of course, is that you feel good afterwards. You don't get that bloating, feel like exhausted after you've eaten, or have that kind of sugar rush followed by the kind of sugar collapse. Need to go and lie down after a heavy lunch, or the rest of your day's kind of better, right? Yeah,
so there's a short-term benefit that, it's lighter, it doesn't drag you down. But the long-term benefit is really where you lock your customers in, because when people who have always had a cold every winter don't have a cold, and they make the connection to the dietary changes, then, they're never going to go back to the other way of eating. And it's that transformation that is why you go into supermarkets and they've got 2 or 3 different kinds of brown rice and a whole selection of organic vegetables. Back in the day, there would be an organic natural foods section. We fought tooth and nail to get out of those sections because we didn't want to be somewhere that people would just push their trolley past. We wanted to be on the shelf next to the non-organic or non-whole food product so that people could make a choice right there at the time. And that was really when the breakthrough happened.
Yeah. I also wanted to mention, your family, you mentioned Joe, your wife, set up the Beauty Bible, you ran the organic bakery in Hastings and a venue for alternative complementary therapies. And Rima, the House of Cardi, and Karim with the fantastical botanicals. Gregory, as you mentioned earlier, you're all at it, aren't you? And sort of living that kind of countercultural thing all the way through, right?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. My daughter today is feeding 100 people, getting food that would otherwise be thrown away by supermarkets and what have you, applying it to people who really need a good square meal. My wife does the Beauty Bible. She thought up the name. The Beauty Bible is big influence in the beauty industry now, and is really, they produce something called the Green Beauty Bible that really moved the beauty industry towards better for you and more sustainable ingredients. So yeah, there's been a pretty positive commitment across the board to doing the right thing and doing it as well as possible.
And you've got your small holding in Hastings. You're growing your own vegetables, and as you told Alice earlier, you're breaking your own bread still, right, for the morning. So
I just have to keep sort of stopping myself from opening a bakery to bake bread that is as good as that bread, because every time people come around, they say, "What is this bread?"
I'm going to ask you to send me the ingredients, and I'll put it in the show notes, okay, so people can try it for themselves at home. I also didn't mention the fact that you prepared the food for the first Glastonbury.
That's right. Well, the first Glastonbury, we were involved in setting it up with Andrew Carr and Arabella Churchill, who were the kind of active protagonists of it. There wasn't any other food available on the site. We took responsibility. There was a guy called Sid Rawls, who later styled himself King of the Hippies, and came down to buy food from us so he could do free food up in the milking parlor. We gave him the food, and he did a sort of bean stew with rice for people who couldn't afford to buy food. Then on the Sunday, word had gotten out that there were 7,000 or 8,000 people in a field near Pilton, near Shepton Mallet, and hot dog vans started appearing. And probably the most gratifying thing of the whole festival was the fact that people surrounded the hot dog vans, rocked them back and forth, shouting, "Out, out, out," and they turned around and left the site. So the kind of purity of the first, I mean, I know now at Glastonbury you can probably get hot dogs, hamburgers, and all the rest of it. Well, you can get
the whole thing. Festival food has massively improved in recent years. I mean, I think it probably went downhill after your first experiences of it. Went down into the more of the kind of hot dog burger end of things. But I mean, in the recent years, it's particularly at festivals like Wormwood, I'm sure Glastonbury too, the food's amazing.
We did Reading as well for several years. And John Peel was emceeing from the stage, so he would give us a plug every couple of hours, say, "Oh, and if you want really good food, go to the macrobiotic food tent." And we did the Isle of Wight Festival. We made a real effort at festivals, served a hell of a lot of food to a hell of a lot of people.
You've been very successful. But when you look back over that time, Craig, right the way back to making that decision to come to London and open a macrobiotic restaurant, you must feel quite proud of the effect that you've had.
I think it was McLuhan who said, "The medium is the message." I was the medium, if you like, but it was the message that is what did it. What I was promoting was a no-brainer, and it still amazes me that it's just taking a hell of a lot longer to get where we're going. But it's the climate, the soil, human health, all of these things could be so much better if people had just listened to me 50 years ago. And it's frustrating from that point of view to see how little progress we've made, but it's gratifying also, to go into a supermarket and seeing all this organic food and seeing all some of it is greenwash, but it's the fact that people use the word organic to give a veneer of quality to everything they're doing is encouraging, because it's getting that in people's minds as a real measure of value and quality. And Brown rice sales, from nothing are huge now. Whole wheat bread sales. People are eating better than they ever have in this century or the last. Quality of food is just getting better and better.
What are you having for supper?
Probably just saute some vegetables, throw some brown rice on top, squirt some tahini and tamari on that to jazz up the flavor and give it a bit of creaminess. And that'll be it.
Craig Sams, thanks very much for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
I really admire what you're doing with this countercultural thing, and thank you.
Thank you. There you have it. A feast, a countercultural feast with the amazing Craig Sams, another person who's extraordinarily modest about his achievements. I don't know about you, but when Craig was talking at the end there, I started to feel a bit hungry, and I decided that I definitely could improve my diet. I might even try the macrobiotic diet for a while and see if it raises my consciousness. Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode and that it raised your consciousness somewhat. If it did, come and join us, bureauoflostculture.com. Become one of our countercultural community. We're keen to build it, to expand it, inspired by people like Craig and Alan Moore and some of the other guests. And we would love to include you. We'll be back next time with more tales from the other side. In the meantime, we're going to finish with one of our frequent sponsors, the artist known as The Real Tuesday Weld. This is a track from their upcoming album, Dreams. It's called The Young Ones, a paean to that youthful spirit, perhaps, that powered the counterculture. See you next time.